Well, thank y'all for having me today. I really enjoyed my chicken lunch, and hopefully I can earn it now. I'm like Cynthia said, I'm one of several assistant state archaeologists with the Office of State Archaeology. Where we work is down at Fort Fisher. We're based at the Fort Fisher State Historic Site, and we're pretty much celebrating our 50th anniversary, our 50th year of operation down there. We started, basically the whole thing started with the discovery of and the excavation of a shipwreck called the Modern Greece back in the early 60s. And it was about the 100th anniversary of the Civil War and in 1962, and everybody was really excited about the 100th anniversary. They were rebuilding the mounds down there, and a group of divers with the Navy came and had heard about this shipwreck called the Modern Greece that was right off the beach there, one of many of them, and so. That's pretty much how the whole thing got started, but let me take us back just a little bit here. As we all know, North Carolina is the graveyard of the Atlantic. And we've all seen this National Geographic poster that shows maybe a couple hundred wrecks on the beaches, on the Outer Banks. Of course, it cuts us off down here. We have plenty of shipwrecks down this way also, but there's actually a lot more than show up on that map. We have archives of at least 5,000 shipwrecks that occurred in North Carolina waters, and this doesn't include the just as many derelicts and different vessels that were just abandoned on the side of the rivers and things like that. And so it's quite a resource, and thankfully, let's go ahead and go to the next one here. Back in the 1980s, there was a state law, we call it the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, but it basically laid claim to all the state waters of North Carolina, all the bottom, the rivers of the navigable waterways in the state of North Carolina out to about 3 miles offshore here. And that pretty much runs the whole length of the coastline. And that's considered state waters, and the state of North Carolina decided that this was a valuable enough resource that they need, these shipwrecks and the artifacts that were on them needed to be protected for the people of North Carolina. They belong to all of us, and that's one of the things that I do. That's my job is during this Abandoned Shipwreck Act actually established a professional staff, or directed the Department of Cultural Resources to establish a professional staff to look out for these shipwrecks. And basically we do this in several ways. We look at a lot of building permits, a lot of development permits, like with the Corps of Engineers, dredging. We always look to see if they're doing the best at determining whether there's a shipwreck in the way of their dredge cutter, which a dredge cutter tears up a shipwreck pretty badly. And so typically they'll have to do some kind of a survey, have to pay a private contractor to go out, survey these shipwrecks, or survey these dredging lanes, and make sure that there's no shipwrecks in the way. If they are, then they have to do some type of mitigation. And but that's pretty much how a lot of our stuff is protected. Another way is just basically going out and inventorying everything that all of our jurisdictional waters to see what kind of wrecks are out there. And we have a variety of different types of watercraft that we find on the North Carolina bottoms. Anything from the shipwrecks that are right on the beach to dugout canoes. That picture there shows a dugout canoe, one of a number of them that were found up in Lake Phelps in the northern part of the state. And this is the bottom left. There's the Northeast Cape Fear. That's a shipwreck we call the Rose Hill wreck because we really don't know the name of it. But at one time, it was the oldest shipwreck that we had in North Carolina. It was dated somewhat around about 1730, 1740, something like that. And then in the bottom right, that's our Queen Anne's Revenge shipwreck project that we've been working on for, let's see, 13 years now, I think. So ever since 1996, anyway. But we have a variety of things that are of resources out there, and our job is just to basically find out where they're at and try to do our best to protect them. If protecting them means doing limited excavation to preserve some of the artifacts off of them, that's typically what we'll do. In the most extreme cases with the Queen Anne's Revenge, which we're trying to bring up the whole shipwreck, and that's quite a daunting task. There's no shipwreck really there, but there's artifacts everywhere. So that's our primary goal there. It's kept us busy, like I said, for the last 13 years. Let's go on to the next. But there's a lot of what we consider somewhat less significant wreck types, but a lot of barges and things that were just basically left on the side of the river to rot because they were no longer useful to the owner. And but these things provide a lot of information on the shipbuilding technology, barge building, and just the general economics of the region. And as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, we're more interested in what these artifacts mean than just the fact that there's artifacts that we can put in a museum. But we're trying to get a grasp on the total economic situation on the rivers, or the significant aspects of warfare and things like that. One of the ways we don't go scuba diving to find shipwrecks. Typically, we'll do remote sensing from a survey boat. This survey boat can be anything from a small john boat up in the little creeks and streams to larger boats, like this is the Cape Fear Community College Martech. It's a nice survey boat. We were out on the river that day, and that picture there shows me throwing a magnetometer into the water. We use a magnetometer, which basically is a pretty sensitive metal detector. It only detects iron, but iron, whenever there's iron, there's a local disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field, and this thing will pick up the disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field, give us a little reading, and through the readout, we can determine whether this is a big piece of iron or a small piece of iron or a crab pot or things like that. We also use side scan survey or sonar, which gives us a visual picture of the bottom. In this case, this is the USS Southfield, which is up in Plymouth, and basically that's the Roanoke River where it's sitting at, and there's no way you would know that there's this really huge shipwreck under the water there unless you had a way to look at it. And the side scan sonar just basically shoots sound waves through the water that reflect off of things, hard objects on the bottom, and comes back to the sonar unit, and the computer figures it all out how it's supposed to look. And you get it's basically like taking a snapshot of the bottom. These are our primary remote sensing methods. Once you do your survey, you do have to go down and find out for sure what you're looking at. Let's see if I can go to that. And, or sometimes if you're lucky, your shipwrecks, you can bring your shipwreck up onto the beach and somebody can sit there and document it there. One of our primary things that we're trying to do is we do a lot of mapping, a lot of drawing. We call it a map, but it's basically a drawing of these different vessels, trying to get the construction features as best we can. This is Mike Alford, who worked with the North Carolina Maritime Museum for years, and he's really a great naval architect, but he's also very interested in these old shad boats and different types of vessels that were built in North Carolina. But this is a little shad boat that was up in Manteo. I don't know if y'all know it, but the Albemarle Sound shad boat is the state boat of North Carolina. And it's because it was basically developed around or on the sounds of North Carolina, not really something that was brought in from the Chesapeake or from down in South Carolina, but pretty significant type of boat, and a lot of them are around in the 19th century. We look at a lot of other things too. Up in the upper left-hand corner is my boss. We're up in the Dismal Swamp Canal. Or actually in the Pasquotank River, right beside the Dismal Swamp Canal, and you can see all the duckweed underwater. This is not always a nice, clean operation. You do a lot of mucking around in the mud in this job, and in the duckweed and everything else. He's holding a PVC pipe, and you'd be amazed how much information you can get on a boat that's completely covered by the mud, but you just basically probe it out to determine the length, the width, and really a lot of the construction details of it just by feeling it. And you never have to really dive on it. You can. He's basically standing on the boat right now. It's in very shallow water, but that's another one of those derelict type sites, and depending on where you are in North Carolina, you'll find different types of vessels, and it's obviously the construction is either being influenced from outside or else it's somebody's innovation right here in North Carolina. Over on the top right is my former boss, who's standing out on Eagles Island, and if anybody's ever been to the waterfront of Wilmington, you can look across the river and just see all kinds of machinery and things over there. It's a whole lot of shipwrecks, a whole lot of boilers and things like that came off of them. And so we try to document everything like that we can. And we have, at this point, we have around 1,000 underwater, or what we consider underwater, or just about underwater sites. This one here would be covered at high tide, but normally a lot of this stuff is actually out of the water. Down in the lower left, you see someone actually having to go beneath the sand, the dredge, to get to the vessel that they're looking at. Very, very shallow water, but with sand over it. This is about the only one we have of cleaning it off so we can document what's underneath. And of course, on the lower right, that's the Queen Anne's Revenge site. And thankfully, we get to stay wet on that one, completely wet. It's only in about 20 feet of water, but it's nice to get out into some nice clean water every once in a while and do some work. But it's a lot more difficult, and it takes a lot more preparation and a lot more finances and everything else. Okay. As far as dredging goes, we do a lot of dredging because typically a wreck sinks to the bottom of the river, it's going to be covered by mud pretty quickly. And that's the way that we, rather than blowing the mud off of it, we basically suck the mud up. And a lot of times there's little artifacts and things like that in the mud, and so we always try to run the outflow through a screen, like you can see beside that little John boat right there, or we run it through a natural gold sluice, like's on the barge there on the right. That would be with the Queen Anne's Revenge, and it's amazing how much with a gold sluice, it's a way to separate the light shell and sand from the metals. Metals are always more dense and they're always a little bit heavier, and they'll be caught in the little baffles that are down at the bottom of that sluice. And we find gold flakes, we find a lot of lead shot, things like that, of really dense metals. And we don't have to go through tons and tons of shell to try to find these things. It basically just washes off the side of the boat. Okay. But our ultimate goal is to produce a site map. As cultural resource managers, we need to know how these things look right now on the bottom. And the whole goal is to go back to these sites and monitor them through time to see how they're changing. These things can be anything from just a drawing like I made on the left there to one that's very detailed and ready for publication, like the one on the right. But the whole idea is to get a visual image of what's down there and try to put it on paper, try to document everything that you can see on the wrecks, and we'll just watch this through time to see how it changes. We are located at Fort Fisher, the site of one of the most massive bombardments in American history at that time. And like I said before, we're there for a reason. And so you can go ahead and flip to the next one there. The Fort Fisher was there because it was built because it protected the new inlet, which was a primary entrance into the Cape Fear River that allowed blockade runners to bring supplies into the Confederacy. And the fort was very important. It's very close to Bermuda, the Bahamas. And because we had actually two entrances to the Cape Fear River down there, it afforded the blockade runners the opportunity to pick their entrance according to whether they ended up south of the river or north of the river. And it was a good situation, lasted for quite a few years. But as a result of this, there's a lot of wrecks that are associated with the Fort Fisher. Several blockaders, Union vessels that accidentally ran aground on the shoals out there, and quite a few blockade runners that were sunk rather than captured and taken up to New York to be sold off. Okay. Blockade runners, they can be. We usually think of these purpose-built vessels that were long and slender and fast, like the Condor there on the left, but there was a surprising number of them that were just little schooners that were not dealing so much in war material as bringing salt into the for consumption in the local consumption, because salt in the 1860s was absolutely critical to preservation of meat. It didn't have refrigeration, and and they basically bring salt in to a lot of these places, like Sloop Point down here was a port that they could use to bring salt in. They could bring it in on one of these little schooners that doesn't draw a whole lot of water, and they could pick up turpentine and naval stores from Sloop Point and then take them out and as payment for the salt. So there's a little trade going on there. As a result, this area here got a lot of attention by the U.S. Navy. Commander Cushing did, I think, 3 raids on this area here, and there's at least 2 of these little schooners that were burnt right back here in the Sound, right behind here. But we haven't found them yet, and we're still looking for them. Okay. But that brings us to the modern Greece. Now, when the modern Greece was found, there was no underwater archaeology branch, no preservation laboratory or anything like that. As you can see, it's not really it's not a small sailing craft, although it was rigged for sail. It was actually a big lumber schooner is what they called it, but it had an engine on it, and it was designed for the Baltic lumber trade. But at the beginning of the American Civil War, it was utilized for blockade running because it could haul a lot of cargo, but it drew a lot of water and had a really hard time getting through any of the inlets. It necessarily needed to go in through the Cape Fear Inlet. It ended up just north of the new inlet where Fort Fisher is, and we're pretty sure they intentionally ran it aground. They were being chased. And there was no way that they were going to get back out to sea, come back around and come in the main entrance of the Cape Fear. And so they ran her aground right under the guns of the fort. They were fired on by the U.S. Navy, and the whole attempt was to destroy the wreck so the Confederates couldn't salvage it. It was carrying a huge load of gunpowder, and so the fort started firing on it to try to wet the powder. So if it exploded, then it wouldn't blow up half the fort too. So it was being shelled from both directions, and as a result, there are some cannonballs that were found on the wreck itself, but she was totally unarmed. None of these blockade runners ever had any guns at all on them, because if they were captured and they had guns aboard, they would be considered pirates, basically. Okay. This is the modern Greece. And like I said, this one here is taken from a airplane. The way a lot of these these blockade runners and different shipwrecks were found were by Menhaden, guys that were flying airplanes for the Menhaden fisheries. They would fly over and try to find a school of Menhaden and then direct the big boats in. But they're also seeing on the days that you have nice clear water, they could see all these shipwrecks out there. This one's laying in about 25 feet of water, but you could still see the outline very well from up above. And this one was probably taken back in the 1970s, something like that. And the wreck was in pretty good condition at that time. But anyway, the modern Greece was known about. A lot of, I think they even had a fishing pier that went out to it. It's right down there beside basically in front of our offices down at Fort Fisher. Okay. And so this group of Navy divers came down. They wanted something to dive on, so the locals told them about the modern Greece that was out there. It just so happened it was right after the Ash Wednesday storm in, I think, 1962. And so it was very much uncovered. A lot of times these wrecks completely sand over, they're completely covered by sand. In this case, it was very easy to get to the deck and all the cargo hold and everything. I say as easy it is if you have C4 that you can place on the ship and blow a hole into it, which is basically what they did. And they went into it, and I mean absolutely collected everything that they could possibly get their hands on. They had I think maybe a 1 or 2 month session in 1962, and then they did a little bit more in 1963. As a result, they brought up something like 12,000 artifacts. Now, when I say artifacts, that's what they're counting these big clumps of artifacts that maybe have 100 artifacts in them. So a lot of these things they call artifacts are just clumps. They haven't been separated out. It brought up a lot of lead. You can see these lead ingots that are sitting on the deck right there. And I don't know why they brought up so much lead, but they did. And thankfully, lead is a very easy material to conserve. You basically dry it out, let it sit there. It develops a nice corrosion layer on the outside of it. It protects it forever, pretty much. And let's see, as we see, There's some more shots of the operation and everything, but it was a pretty well organized operation. You can imagine the U.S. Navy does a pretty good job of things like that. And so they basically, the whole idea was they brought it up and they're going to turn it over to the state. Well, at the time, the only thing that was going on down at Fort Fisher was basically they were rebuilding the mounds out there. They had a lot of trees and things on them. And they were doing some work on the mounds, so they just happened to have a facility right there next to the wreck site that they could bring this stuff to. And the problem with artifacts that are brought up out of the seawater like that is you cannot just let them dry out. You have to keep them wet. You have to store them in tanks. They're filled with water pretty much until you get the salt out of them. And because they brought so much stuff up, we still have stuff in tanks down there, or we did up until recently, that have been in there for 50 years because we just didn't have the money and the time. I mean, we're finding new shipwrecks all the time, and more artifacts are coming in. And so basically they cleaned off a nice selection of them. You can see these guys those are Enfield rifles that they're handling right there, and really conservation of material from that period at that period of time in the early '60s. Nobody really knew a whole lot about getting salts out of iron and conserving wood and things like that. So basically, the state hired some farm boys to come and help them. And farm boys can figure things out. I don't know if y'all know many farm boys, but I always love working with them because if you have any problem at all, they'll figure out a way to deal with it, you know. And so they basically did. They get on the phone, they talk to people in Europe, they talk to people down in Texas, anywhere that they could get some information about conserving artifacts. They would find out about it and give it a try. Let's see, I'm getting a little bit behind here. Okay, that's another one of the Navy divers there. Let's go to the next one there. And that's basically the lab back in the '60s there. You can see there's an anchor there in the cage. That's one of the anchors that's down at Fort Fisher. That came off of the modern Greece. And that building was basically completely full of artifacts. And they were working hard to get them cleaned off. They basically, they would run a lot of it through electrolysis, which is one of the ways that we use to get the salts out of artifacts and coating them, just doing it as quickly as they could. They experimented with a lot of things. Some of them, the processes didn't work at all and basically lost the artifacts. But there were so many of them and so many duplicates because this was cargo. So a lot of the stuff was just repetitious artifacts, more files than you can possibly imagine, hoe heads, picks, and things like that. So they had the luxury of being able to experiment a little bit with maybe even some of the artifacts that weren't in as good a shape, just to see what works. And they came up with a pretty good system, and it's amazing. Probably 40 years later, a lot of those artifacts look pristine. They look great. And I commend those guys. They did a good job. That's my old boss, Leslie Bright, right there, which he may have come up and talked to y'all at some point. But he was pretty much one of the first conservators down there. And I was lucky enough to get his position when he retired. Okay. But while these artifacts were being conserved, they were still going out to the wreck site, picking up a few more things. In fact, they actually had a volunteer program where they would take divers out to the wreck, drop them off. They'd pick up everything they could, or anything that looked cool. They'd bring it up and divide it with the state. If the conservators wanted it, hadn't seen anything quite like it, then they would give it to the conservators. Otherwise, they got to keep the artifacts. And I have quite a few artifacts come in here and there from people that participated in this program, and the artifacts didn't necessarily get conserved very well, so they come back in pretty rough shape. So we don't do that anymore, really. We recognize that you do need to do a constant, or you need to kind of know what you're doing to conserve these artifacts and have good results. In the meantime, while like I said, more shipwrecks were being found the whole time, and basically the modern Greece collection got it kind of put off to the side. When I was hired on, there was these 4 big tanks out in the backyard that were absolutely full of artifacts. And I think that was one of my questions on my interview was, what will you do with the modern Greece artifacts? And I gave a pretty good answer, but it is such a daunting task, and we've had more and more artifacts come in from various reasons. The Queen Anne's Revenge, plus a lot of smaller wrecks, and the treasure hunters. We've actually worked with some treasure hunters they turn over the artifacts to us to conserve, and so we're basically swamped with artifacts. And we had all this stuff in the backyard sitting there in pretty good, it's stable at least. We didn't have to deal with it, so it was put on the back burner until about last year, I think. Okay, it's a guy with a side scan sonar out surveying the river. Another side scan image. Okay. And man drawing one of the blockade runners. Okay. There's the modern Greece. There's a nice perspective drawing. As you can see, it doesn't look like much of a ship anymore. When they're in shallow water, like the modern Greece is, they get just slammed by all the hurricanes and things like that. And so it's basically broken apart. It was iron hull, and there's still a lot of iron out there. If you drive over it in a boat, you can see a huge swirl down underneath there because it's really in fairly shallow water. Okay. And basically, this map right here is showing all the different blockade runners. One of our big initiatives was to try to get every wreck from the Civil War into a National Register district. As we find more, we keep adding them to the district, but we have them all the way from Holden Beach all the way up to right down here to the Topsail Inlet where the Phantom is. The Phantom it really is a phantom because it was visited, I think, in the 70s by divers, but then it became covered up. Nobody's really seen the Phantom since then. And I'm thinking because the inlet has migrated so far south, it's probably on Topsail Island right now, probably under all that, the big sand berm that's out there right now. So it may not even be an underwater site anymore. Okay. Anyway, last year we invited the Maritime Studies program from East Carolina University down to the lab to help us inventory all the stuff that was out in these tanks. It was, a great opportunity for these kids that are trying to learn to be conservators. This was a conservation class. Their program it's a history program, but there is a maritime studies track that you can take. And one of the classes that you do take is conservation, and another is survey work, all the things that you really need to know to be a cultural resource manager to be able to protect the wrecks. But in this case, they had certainly never seen any kind of collection like this, and it's a really good lesson to them because the modern Greece collection should never have been brought up and then sat in tanks for 50 years. This is not what we want to do. What we try to do in these days is we try to determine how much we can deal with in a given amount of time and not bring up any more than we can deal with at a time. Because when you bring it up, you have to keep it in, you have to build a tank for it, you have to fill it with water, you have to maintain a certain pH in the water. And it takes people to do that. And it takes people away from other things that they could be doing. So a lot of times these wrecks are a lot better off right out there in the water, all the artifacts out there. As artifacts are needed, it doesn't take long to go out there and get 2 or 3 years worth of work. So that's what I'm trying to teach these kids is don't go out there and get trapped in, I mean, everybody's always wanting, they're pushing the field work, pushing everything, taking the divers out there, they get the camera crews out there, bringing up all the cool stuff, but then once it's up, it kind of goes on the back burner. It doesn't seem quite as exciting, even though it is. To me, it's more exciting in the laboratory than it is out there in the water because that's where you're opening up the Christmas presents. You know, you're finding out what you have. And that's the really good stuff. And that's what has to be done. Otherwise, it's just a block. And block of concretion. Let's click through. Yeah, there's my tank right there. You can see there's grass growing all over it and everything. And this is not a way to treat artifacts, but it was a way to keep them stable for a while, 50 years, until we were able to deal with them. You can see some of the students working with the artifacts. It was actually it was a great opportunity. I had never seen all of this stuff. I'd done little inventories in some of those tanks, but never brought everything up. So it was a learning experience to me also. Okay, some more stuff. Okay, what do y'all reckon that is? Let's see. Oh yeah, I know what that's. What I'm going to do is just show you some of the artifacts that we did bring up, and some of the stuff I'm having to deal with right now because I think it's important that y'all see it, and you'll probably never see it in the condition it is right now. You'll see it in the museums once it's been conserved and everything. But this is a roll of telegraph wire. Believe it or not, it's a roll of copper wire. You know, telegraph was around well before the Civil War, and it was used extensively during the Civil War. So, and I never thought about finding a big roll of copper wire in a blockade runner, but that's one of the types of things that you would see on there. It was manufactured in England and brought over here. Okay. Here's another example of how things were packaged on board of a blockade runner. Most things were put in a cask, like a barrel. And this, what you're seeing right here is a barrel of files. Every kind of size file, everything just kind of packed together, but they're in like little clumps, and they were packed into a barrel. The barrel is completely corroded off of the outside of it. And what you're seeing instead of the files themselves is what we call concretion. Anytime iron goes into the seawater, it starts corroding immediately. And because the seawater's super saturated with calcium carbonate, the corrosion is somewhat acidic and causes the calcium carbonate to form on the outside of the artifact. Thus you get what looks like concretion all over or concrete all over the outside of the artifacts. And that's one of the problems we have is cleaning them off. But a good thing about it is it kind of protects the artifacts. It seals them up so that you don't have a whole lot of corrosion in the direct seawater. So it's actually a good thing, but it's also a problem. Here's a small collection of table knives. These all had ebony handles on them. They were steel blades, but you can see the ebony doesn't form concretion on it. It's wood, and you just don't have the corrosion going on with that. But everywhere you have iron, where the blades were, you have this concretion that's built up on it, and that's because it was corroding in the seawater. And underneath it are going to be knives that look similar to this. Steel doesn't do so well, especially thin steel like a butter knife does not do that well under salt water for 100 years. But amazingly, it's preserved as much as it has. Okay. Here's some parts to guns that were found in the tanks. These were probably removed from guns and somehow or another made it back into the tank. Up at the top, you see some trigger mechanisms, some hammers, some locks, even a buckle off of a sling, probably. But, here's a block. Anybody have an idea what that might be? No way that you could. Okay, go on to the next one. Oh yeah, chisels, that's what they are. They're actually wood chisels or gouges. I think there's a lot of these things brought in. And they were all made in Sheffield, England. Sheffield was a big manufacturer of steel products at the time, and they found a great outlet in the Confederacy. Just brought thousands and thousands of these gouges and wood chisels, and I think they were probably used as much for turning wood on a lathe as they were for actually mortising out pieces of wood. But you know, we're in the day before electricity, so everything had to be done by hand in those days. But what's amazing to me is you can go to the hardware store these days, and pretty much if it doesn't have an electric motor on it, they had it back during the Civil War. It's all the hand tools they had, and a lot of them look very similar. These are chisels, but the handles are gone. Nowadays, you'd see the handle in the hardware store already affixed to the chisel, but back in the day, they a lot of times affixed their own handle to it, and there were actually some handles that were packaged too that were found on board the ship. Okay. What you see in here are a couple of what I call Bowie knives. Some people will argue with me about that, but a Bowie knife in those days, we're talking right after the Mexican War, and Jim Bowie made a big impact on the Americans and even Europeans. And basically, any sheath knife was called a Bowie knife back in those days, at least for a while. Tons of these things. These were not war materials. These were actually being brought to the Confederacy to sell to soldiers or anybody else that need a fancy knife to carry on his side. And everybody carried a side knife in those days. They didn't have belt loops on their, well, most people didn't wear a belt in those days. They wore suspenders. But what they'd have would be what they call a frog. And if you see that little button up there on the top, that's actually this sheath that you're seeing, the throat and the tip on a sheath, and then the blade on the inside. The leather is gone off of it. You can see the guard and part of the handle. The handle is missing off the knife. But they would all be carried in what they call a frog. It's basically a holder that these would slide into. And there's the handles off of them. It's quite a mismatch of artifacts. Actually, that one in the middle there is a table knife, but the rest of them would be what we consider Bowie knives, or what would have been considered at the time. But it's basically just a sheath knife. And there's a rack of rifles. A lot of infield rifles came off of that wreck. Actually, two different sizes of rifles. One of them was kind of a carbine-sized rifle. And another was a much longer rifle that would have had a triangular bayonet. But they were used extensively by the Confederacy and the Union, for that matter. Infield rifles. We just didn't have enough rifles for everybody to be armed in the military during the Civil War. But that's after they came in big boxes, big crates, and you can see the packing partitions. It's kind of a little wooden thing on either end there. It kind of separate them out, but they'd lay them in butt to muzzle, butt to muzzle, butt to muzzle, and probably about 4 layers of these rifles per case. So each case could carry 20, 25 rifles pretty much. But most of ours are broken down into layers, what we call racks of rifles. And we have quite a few of those guys. They're completely covered by concretion for the large part, except for the wood. And a lot of times the wood gets covered with concretion just because it's in contact with the metal, and so the whole thing will get concreted up. But that's pretty much what one of the rifles would look like underneath once it's broken loose. Okay. And one of the ways we get the concretions off is basically through what we call an air scribe. It's a little pneumatic tool that just basically picks the concretion off of it. This fellow, he's one of my interns from UNCW, who was working this winter, and he's cleaning off a block of files. Now, this block of files would have come out of a big concretion, barrel concretion, and it was just one of the blocks that they fitted into there. But now it's all concreted up. And what he's doing is taking the concretion off with this little pneumatic tool, and we can eventually break these things apart if we want to. What I'm trying to do is conserve these things all in one big block, like they are right now, because that's really the only way you can get a good feel for what was going on with these blockade runners. These aren't individual artifacts. This is cargo. These things are being carried by the thousands. And what I really like about them is that they're still in their original context. They're originally packed that way in England and packed into a barrel. And if we could possibly conserve them all together and not break them apart, it would make our job easier. Plus, it would, I think, be a better exhibit in the museum. Okay. And this is electrolysis going on. This is the process of removing the salt or the chloride molecules from the iron. You see a little trigger. That's a trigger mechanism off an Enfield rifle, and a little sear off of an Enfield rifle, and an iron spike on the right there. But basically, these are hooked up to something like a battery charger. The negative lead going to the artifacts, the positive lead going to that piece of stainless steel back behind there, and it draws the chloride out of it. And so it's been used for years and years, and it's a very effective way to not only remove salt from an artifact, but to also clean it up. If you notice down on the bottom, there's a lot of crumbly red-looking stuff. That's the corrosion product and the concretion that's fallen off of it, because it sits there and it produces hydrogen gas. It's always bubbling while it's in the electrolysis, and that tends to just clean it off a little bit. But most of our setups are a little bit bigger than this. This is just done in a little 8-gallon aquarium, so that we could get a good picture of it, basically. And here's some hose that ran through the electrolysis. The salt's basically cleaned out of them, and after that we'll coat them with tannic acid, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Acid typically eats iron, but tannic acid will actually convert the exterior of the artifact to a ferric tannate, and which is a very stable material as opposed to just raw metal or raw steel like these would be. And so that's one of our treatments. That's why a lot of times you see the Civil War projectiles and stuff look really black or purple looking, and it's because of the tannic acid they put on them. And then after that, we coat them down with an acrylic to prevent moisture from getting into the artifact. And there's home. That's where I work, and that's the preservation lab and a lot of the stuff in the background. And if y'all have any questions, please ask.
I know that the whole East Coast has been designated as graveyard in Atlantic, so I guess there's a lot of wreck falls down the coast. But do you primarily work around frying pan shoals? Is that real rich area for wreck?
Typically, most of our work is even closer in than that. You'll find most of your shipwrecks around the inlets for the most part, or up in the creeks and things like that, where they would basically take the derelicts up there just to get them out of the channel and let them rot. So that's where a lot of our work is done, is around the inlets and of course anywhere else that there happens to be a wreck. But we don't get out on frying pan too often, and plus the outer shoals are really out of our jurisdiction. We only go 3 miles out. Yes. we actually have two ironclads in the Cape Fear River. One of them is where at the rocks, right where the rocks go off at the south of Fort Fisher. That's the CSS Raleigh, which basically made one sortie out and then ran aground, and her back was broken, and that was it. The other one is the CSS North Carolina that's opposite of Southport. Basically, they didn't copper the bottom, so teredo swarms ate holes all in the bottom of it. It basically sank it at its moorings there. Roots? It's the only one I've ever worked on. As far as I know, there's supposed to be another one of his ships very, very close by there, but we have surveyed and surveyed and have never run across something we can definitively say was the other one of his. Mm-hmm. Well, what that was basically some academics who have realized that we haven't written the definitive why this is the Queen Anne's Revenge, and they were putting us on the spot, which we needed to be put on the spot. And we finally did get the article written point by point by point by point why we think this is the Queen Anne's Revenge. And there's never really been a problem in my mind as it was, but you know, if you're not dealing with the artifacts and see all these artifacts that are just absolutely to the right time period, then it's, oh, absolutely. We'll be going out this fall. Mm-hmm. Money, if we have the money.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Y'all are great.